Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to do a bit more to the Hercules Hobbies Actros. We've already got most of the mechanicals done on the chassis. Last time we tested and fitted the gearbox. We're going to start with step 26, assembling the coupler. There's not all that many parts for this one, but the assembly is a bit fiddly. If you've built a Tamiya one, you're going to know what to expect. For the plastics we need the X3 coupler plate, X4 the latch, X2 the cover for the trailer detection switch and slider, and X1 the slider itself. Probably more than any other part of the build, other than maybe the gearbox, we need to be very careful about smoothing out the moulding nubs on the parts. For it all to work smoothly, it all needs to be able to slide without catching. It doesn't take much to make coupling up to the trailer a bit stubborn. For the metal bits and fixings, we need everything from the bag. There's the brass coupler nut, the return spring for the latch, what they call the support spring, but it's more of a return spring for the trailer detection slider, a 4mm ball end, an M3 press nut, an M3 flange nut, an M3x10 screw, 3 M3x8 countersunk screws, 2 M2x5 screws, and 2 2x6 washers. The first job then is to install the return spring on the latch. It uses an M2x5 screw and one of the washers. When tightening up the screw, we want to do it up until it just starts to grip the loop on the spring, then back it off just enough that the spring can spin freely. If it's stiff, the return mechanism won't quite work as intended. The second bit is to attach the ball end, which just screws into the corner hole on the latch. Next we have the plastic plate and the metal internal plate. All the holes line up nicely. However, after the initial assembly, I did have to take it all apart again and fettle the bends a bit as it didn't quite fit on the steel bracket in the next step. It ended up very close, but it didn't quite move freely. To attach the plates together, we need to use one of the countersunk screws and the flange nut. For now, we'll just lightly nip it up so we can still line up all the other holes. Next we've got the latch. In the large hole in the middle of the latch we need to smear a little bit of grease just to make sure the brass coupler nut stays nice and smooth. Then the nut goes in through the spring side of the latch so it will stick out very slightly from the other side. Wipe away any excess grease, being careful not to get any in the threads. Line it up over the centre hole on the aluminium plate and install the countersunk screw from the top. The spring now needs to be attached to the hole on the edge of the plastic plate using the same size screw and washer as the other end. It's a bit fiddly holding it in position while getting the screw to start, and the main thing is, just like the latch end, the screw needs to be just loose enough that the spring can freely rotate. When it's in, the latch should very smoothly unlatch and spring back with no binding. If it's not 100% perfect, now's the time to figure out why. It doesn't take much of a bind to cause problems coupling up to a lightweight trailer. Next we have the slider for the trailer detection switch. Now it's not strictly necessary to fit these bits, you can replace them with a countersunk screw and a nut. However, it's easier to get it working now rather than having to strip it down later when it's all greasy and grubby. We are going to be fitting a switch to the coupler at some point. Now it's a direct copy of the Tamiya coupler, so the switch from Tamiya's MFC kit should drop straight in. Before we put the bits together, we need to give the trench that the slider runs in a nice coat of grease. Usually they end up running quite well, but they can get themselves in a bit of an angle sometimes and bind, so really lathering it all up in grease helps a lot in keeping it nice and reliable. Next we pop the small spring in the slot in the bottom of the slider and drop it into the trench. It's a bit of a balancing act as you have to compress the spring a little bit just to get it in. Just be careful not to let the spring ping away. A little extra smear of grease on the top of the slider wouldn't hurt, but it's not a major thing. Surprisingly, I find after a few bumps from a trailer, the grease finds its way around anyway. To hold it all together, we need to fit the cover. It's held on with the M3x10 on one end, and another countersunk screw and press nut on the other. When we fit the switch, this bit will need to come off again, but it's fairly straightforward to do. Now, I would normally recommend using thread lock on all of the metal bits, but if your build goes anything like mine, you're probably going to be taking things apart again in the next section to fettle things to get the coupler moving freely on its mount. For now anyway, we have a rather nice little assembly assembled. Next then, we're on to another bag. This one covers step 27 to 29. We've got the usual bag of screws and a bag with various big metal bits. For step 27, we'll need the steel plate, the long pin and the linkage, the two 4mm cups, there's a 3x28 shaft used as a hinge pin, a small scissor spring, a funky coarse self-tapper with a hole in the end for a body clip, which in the kit is actually M3, but it still does the same job. There's the body clip. For fixings we need a 2mm E-clip, two 3x8 self-tappers, two 3x10 self-tappers, and two M3x8 machine screws. We're going to need some plastic bits too. There's D1, the cap for the battery holder hinge, an unmarked part, which is the end of the battery tray, the battery strap, the battery tray itself, and we'll also need the plastic mounting plate for the coupler. First we'll put the linkage together just to get it out of the way. It wants to be 46mm between the inside faces of the ball cups. Having said that, for this particular linkage it's not really all that critical. As long as it's somewhere near, it's going to work just fine. Here's the plastic plate to mount the coupler. It's quite a simple part, and it would be very easy to design one to 3D print to move the coupler forwards or even backwards a bit. Next, the steel plate needs to be mounted to the coupler. Now it should be a simple case of sliding the spring onto the pin, lining up the parts and popping it through. However, we can get the pin most of the way through, but there's no way it's going to go through all the way. Turns out one of the holes in the steel plate wasn't quite drilled out smoothly. There's still just a little bit of metal sticking out. It's an easy fix though, we just need to run a drill bit through to clear it out. Now the pin goes all the way through, which is progress, but it still doesn't quite line up. I ended up having to tweak the bends just a little bit to get it moving nicely. I think this is one of the minor things you lose out on with a cheaper kit. The Tamiya couplers usually all but fall together. With the E-clip on the end, it's ready to fit to the plastic plate. It lines up with the two holes, and we use two M3x8s to attach the parts. When it's all together, it should move very freely and spring back all by itself. Just like with the latch, if it's not moving nicely, it's going to make coupling up to a trailer more difficult than it really should be. That just leaves clipping the linkage onto the latch ball. The cups are soft enough that it's quite easy just to press them on by hand. Next we've got the battery tray. First on is the end cap. It fits rather nicely, keeping itself in position, so all we need to do is install the two 3x10 self-tappers. At the other end we need to fit the screw with the hole in the end for the body clip. Now I tried to thread it straight in, but it really didn't want to go. So to make it easier, I ran an M3 tap through, which made life a lot easier. When doing it up, we just need to keep in mind that the hole in the end wants to go across the battery tray, so we can still get the clip in. For the strap, we need to slide the hinge pin in through the hole in the end and offer it up to the battery tray. To keep it in, there's a cover that fits to the underside, trapping the pin. It's held in with two 3x8 self-tappers. When it's all done up, the strap should move completely freely and line up with the end of the screw. If it does, pop the body clip in and we're done with step 27. Step 28 then, and it's a nice simple one. We just need four M3x8s, the battery tray and a chassis. The tray lines up with some holes on the chassis and we just pop in the four screws. You just need to keep in mind that it does have a right way round. The strap side of the battery tray goes on the opposite side of the chassis to the servo. Right, step 29 is next then. We've got the fuel tanks and the coupler lever. We're going to be needing the tanks, Q12 and 14. Now Q12 has a platform for mounting the ESC, which is good for cooling, but it really doesn't look great. There's P4, the mounting plate for the coupler lever, P7, the coupler lever itself, and we're going to need a silver bushing, a 3x7 washer, a 4mm ball end, an M2 nut, an M3x10 self-tapper, 4 3x8 self-tappers, and 6 M3x6s. Starting with the lever, we need to screw the 4mm ball end in a middle hole with the M2 nut on the back. There's a hex-shaped hole, so it's all nice and easy to do. Next, the bushing goes in through the bottom of the large hole with the M3x10 self-tapper and the washer in through the top. It then screws into the middle hole in the mounting plate. None of this is all that critical, just make sure it can spin freely. If it's stiff, it's going to bind the rocking motion of the coupler and the latch. Next we have the fuel tanks, which interestingly mount to the battery tray rather than the chassis. It makes a lot of sense for the stock build, but changing the battery tray or the fuel tanks will be a bit more of a faff than I'd like. They attach using 2 of the M3x8 self-tappers on each side. I'm sure we'll come up with something to get them looking a bit more scale though. It's just going to take a bit more thought than I'd hoped. On the top of the chassis we need to mount the coupler plate. There's just 4 of the M3x6s that go through the plate and straight into M3 threaded holes in the top of the chassis. And lastly there's the lever plate that mounts just forward of the coupler with the last 2 M3x6s. Clip the ball cup onto the ball on the lever and that's step 29 complete. It's not quite as smooth as the Tamiya kits, but there wasn't really anything all that difficult to overcome. I think it's still quite acceptable for the price. Now we've got a bit more mounted to the chassis, it's really starting to look very solid, very purposeful. I like it. So that's it for this week then. Next week, assuming we do more to the Actros, we will be getting it on its wheels, so that should be fun. And as always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if you got something to say. Bye guys.